I want to talk to you guys about European history and really European history. I don't want to give you guys like a general explanation of European history, but I want to tell you guys about some of the wackiness of European history. Because one thing that you will notice, if you ever read anything about Europe's history, one thing that you will notice is that they literally never stopped killing each other. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of people butchering each other because some guy owned 7 acres, or maybe he owned a half an acre, and bam, he had his own private army, and the other guy had his own private army, and they started butchering each other over a third of an acre or something like that. And that's how it was. Like, people were butchering each other all the time. It's only just recently that Europeans have been living in peace for the most part, unless, of course, you want to include the Balkans, which wasn't so peaceful back in the 1990s. But for the most part, Europe has been at peace for 7+ decades. It's quite an accomplishment. I have to give my hats off to you guys. And whoever was responsible for that has to get the Nobel Peace Prize, because that is quite a feat. That is quite an accomplishment to achieve. But anyway, yeah, when you read Europe's history, it's crazy. Like, people never stopped killing each other, and they would go on these wars that would last for decades or even centuries over differences in opinion over land or whatever. People would just be butchering each other. And it wouldn't just be wars. Sometimes it would be just damn near riots or horrific riots that would happen. And then you would have people taking over entire cities because of theological differences. And there's actually an example of that. But one thing that, and I'll get to the example in a moment here, but one thing that you will notice when reading this history is that nothing has ever really changed for the most part in human society. Nothing has ever really changed. Because today you have cult leaders, and back in the day you had cult leaders. The only difference is that cult leaders back in the old days of Europe's history could start a private army and take over entire regions, and that was actually a lot more common in those days. So, for example, there was a heretic by the name of Arnold of Brescia. And Arnold of Brescia was a rebel rouser. He was a monk who believed that if a church leader, a priest, a bishop, a cardinal, if a church leader owned property, he could not administer the sacraments. He couldn't give the Eucharist. He couldn't hear confession. He could not administer the sacraments. He was essentially no longer a prelate or an ecclesiastical leader. And this was a form of revolution. It was rebellion, because the religious system of Europe was Catholicism. And so once you started saying, well, this priest actually isn't legitimate, this cardinal is not legitimate, this pope is not legitimate, once you start saying that, then you undermine the entire moral framework and harmony of the society, and that leads off into a whole bunch of other unbalances in the society, because religion really does precede political frameworks and political paradigms. So once you start changing the religion, then you start changing the political system. So it really was a tremendous move of revolutionary politics for Arnold of Brescia to do this. Basically, if Arnold of Brescia were alive today, he would be one of these anarcho-communist or maybe an anarcho-capitalist, and he would be, I don't know, on YouTube talking about why Pope Francis needs to be overthrown, and he'll talk about his connections with the Swiss Army guards, and how he's going to do a revolution or something like that. But anyway, Arnold of Brescia began to teach these things, and it started some pretty tumultuous events in Italy. There were people who were attacking religious leaders. They went into the home of one religious leader. I think it was the home of a bishop, and they started stealing his stuff. And they were like, hey, this property doesn't belong to you bishops or to you priests. It belongs to the people. It belongs to el gente. And so it was basically like Che Guevara type politics, but with a religious mask on it. And so eventually, Arnold of Brescia got so powerful, he actually threw the Pope out of Rome. They actually drove the Pope out. There's a lot of things that like this that happened back in the day. There were all sorts of events. that you can read like this in Christian history. Today, we're just complaining about Pope Francis and how bad he is, but it's like back in the day, people would throw the Pope out. You know what I mean? Like it was actually possible. People did things like that. And so there was a revolution. The Pope was thrown out, and here was Arnold, this monk who was, Mr. Monastic living in a cave. Now all of a sudden he's ruling the city of Rome. He's ruling the Vatican. He became the Pope, which really goes to show you that people who start revolutions are just simply angry, that they're not the ones who are in power. They hate the elites, yet they want to be the elite. So Arnold of Brescia was now the leader. And eventually, the new Pope, it was Pope Eugene the Fourth or the Fifth. I don't remember. No, sorry, it was Pope Adrian the Fourth. Pope Adrian the Fourth. The Pope that got overthrown, he was Pope Eugene the Third. He died, and then Pope Adrian the Fourth took control of Rome, and they got an army led by Mr. Frederick Barbarossa, and this was in the mid-1150s, mid-1150s, and Arnold of Brescia was eventually thrown out. He was overthrown, and then he was arrested and then declared to be a rebel and a subversive element in society, because that's what he was. And then eventually he was hanged to death, and then his body was burned. There was actually an event that happened when they burned his body. I'm pretty sure I remember reading this. When they burned Arnold's body, one of his female followers jumped onto his body and was engulfed in the flames. It sounds like Charlie Manson's The Family. That's what it sounds like. There was another cult that I remember reading about years ago. Years ago, I would read all sorts of literature on the Middle Ages and on the Renaissance period, Byzantine Empire. Very, very rich and beautiful history. I recommend people read on this history. It's quite enriching, and it gives you a great idea as to, where the church has come from, like how far the church has come from. So many centuries, really millennia of struggle and fights and wars, and it really gives you an appreciation for the Christian faith. It really does. But there was a cult that I remember reading about. It was back in, I want to say, the 1400s, 1300s, but there was this cult in Italy that basically believed in free love, and they said that a great way to fulfill yourself spiritually is to basically indulge in any sin that you want. So they had orgies, and people were banging each other, and they had a compound somewhere in the forests of Italy. They had this compound. It was like a village, but it was really a cult compound. And everybody was banging each other, and there was free love and sex, and people were just doing whatever the hell they wanted, and it was just chaotic and lawless and all this stuff. So the church found out what was happening, and they sent in an army. The church used to have armies. They had papal armies, and these guys could take over entire regions. People were horrified of the Pope. At one point in time, kings were terrified of the church. Kings were terrified of the Pope. He had his own army. He could kick ass. But anyway, they sent in this army, and the army went to this cult compound. I guess they told everyone to surrender and put their clothes back on. And the people in this compound did not want to acquiesce. They didn't want to surrender to the papal authority, so there was a shootout that happened. I think it lasted for like an hour or something. Papal army won, killed the heretics, and that was the end of that. But you read this story, and you're like, wow, this sounds like David Koresh. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. And then you read about some of the much larger, much vaster heretical movements that really, really devastated the power of the church. And one of them was the movement of Jan Hus. Here was Jan Hus. Jan Hus moved to England. I think he worked as like a servant somewhere, or a waiter in a restaurant, something like that, when he was living in England, because he moved to England, and he worked there as an employee. While he was in England, he began to absorb the teachings of John Wycliffe. He went back to his home country, which was Bohemia, which essentially is today's modern-day Czech Republic, some parts of Germany, but mainly modern-day Czech Republic. If you go to the Czech Republic today, people still revere Jan Hus, even people who are atheists. And the Czech Republic is one of the most atheistic societies in the world. people there still revere Jan Hus. But Jan Hus, he came back because he absorbed the heresies of Wycliffe, and one of the heresies of Wycliffe was that that the Eucharist was not really the body and blood of Christ. Now, Jan Hus, from what I have read, did not teach this, but Jan Hus was very much so inspired by Wycliffe's defiance against church authority. And Jan Hus was more about defiance against church authority. He also rejected indulgences. He rejected indulgences, and he believed that, well, I'm pretty sure he believed that the Pope was the harlot of Babylon, or not the Antichrist, but he believed that Rome, the Vatican, was the harlot of Babylon. Anyway, he basically was leading a separatist movement against the Holy Roman Empire, which was being ran by the Emperor Sigismund, and it was more so a political movement. It was masqueraded with religion, but it was extremely political. And it was all about separatism, separating from the Holy Roman Empire, creating this reformist, Hussite, essentially Protestant state. So the Catholic Church sent a papal bull to Bohemia, and the papal bull essentially said that Jan Hus is a heretic and all that. So Jan Hus's followers take the papal bull and they take a prostitute and they stripped her naked, they put her on a horse, and they take the papal bull and they pin the papal bull on one of her breasts. And they parade this woman on a horse and they start screaming, "Here lies the harlot of Babylon." So Jan Hus was eventually arrested, he was put on trial, and he was told many times to recant his positions, and he refused all the time. And then they said, "Okay, Mr. Huss, you're very obstinate, you're very stubborn, we have no choice but to put you to death." And they say that Jan Hus broke down in tears. He wanted some mercy, and they told him, "No shot, you're going to die." And that was it. So they killed Jan Hus, they burned his body at the stake, and the whole damn region of Bohemia just went off. I mean, people lost their minds. And the Hussites, the followers of Jan Hus, they began to butcher the Catholic population in Bohemia. They took over the entire University of Prague. They actually did some pretty horrific executions. They took some Catholic prelates, some Catholic, basically Catholic leaders, and they they lined them up, or not lined them up, but they put them together, and the Hussites gave the Hussites basically gave them a choice. If you want to live, behead the guy next to you, or behead the other people in the room. And they were like, "You want us to behead each other?" Yes. It was like something out of Saw. And one guy said, I'll behead them." He took the knife and beheaded the people around him. It was really horrific. And the Hussites did this just for their own sadistic pleasure. Like, instead of just executing these people, they said, no, we want to watch which one is going to behead the others. Yeah. Just for their own sadistic entertainment. And the Hussites did this revolt, and it led to a horrific war called the Hussite Wars, which didn't really end until like 20 years later or something. It lasted, I want to say, about 2 decades or so. The Hussites were ferocious warriors. The Catholics never really defeated them. The Hussites practically invented the tank. They invented the tank, for crying out loud. They got these huge wagons, and they put some, I want to say, horses or oxen on them. They protected the horses with something, I believe, but nonetheless, they had these slots all around these wagons, and they would put their guns and their crossbows through the slots, and they would just have these wagons ram right through the Catholic ranks, and they would just open fire on the Catholic troops and run them over with the wagon. It was really, really horrifying. The Catholics at one point in time sent in some German fighters, some German mercenaries to fight these Hussites. And once the Germans heard the sound of these wagons coming, they ran away. I mean, it was horrifying. They were absolutely terrified. And the Hussites never really lost. In fact, the Catholics had to make a compromise with them because they were so vicious and so difficult to fight. So the Catholics just said, you know what, we'll do a compromise with these people. And the Hussite controversy was never really settled because back, in the 17th century, the Hussites would revolt again, and that would lead up to the 30 Years' War. And then you talk about the Reformation. You got, Martin Luther, who was Mr. Monk, and then from Mr. Monk, he started sitting on a toilet, experiencing the Holy Spirit. No doubt. I mean, I'm not even joking here. This is actually what Luther said. He said that he would feel the presence of the Holy Spirit sitting on the toilet. And then you had Mr. Zwingli, who was like, well, the Eucharist isn't really the body and blood of Jesus. It's all symbolic. The Pope is the harlot of Babylon, etc., etc. Pope is the Antichrist. And that eventually led to a civil war in Switzerland. People were butchering each other in Switzerland. There was the First Kappel War, which was essentially a civil war between the Catholic Swiss and the Protestant Swiss. And Ulrich Zwingli, actually fought in the battle, took his gun and went off into the Protestant jihad. And Zwingli fought in that battle, and the Protestants would win the First Kappel War. And Zwingli wanted to kill all the Catholics. He said, we should give these people no quarter. Doesn't matter if they surrender, kill them all. And there was one Protestant who stepped in, and he's like, yeah, I'm not going to stand for this. So they settled that one, and then fighting broke out again, and the Catholics won in the Second War. But it just never really ended. First and Second Kappel War, you had the wars of religion in France, and eventually it culminated into the 30 Years' War, which was the most horrific war that Europe ever had before the First and Second World Wars. It just never really ended. It never ended. And European history is just so wacky that way. And you can say, well, Ted, there's wars all the time. Yes, I know, but what really perplexes me about Europe is that at one point in time, it was the head of Christendom. And it has the Church of Peter in Rome. And even then, people were killing each other. Which really goes to show you that even with a Christian society, the forces of the diabolical are still going to foment tremendous chaos and problems. The forces of hell, the forces of Satan, really are the forces of chaos. And they are going to foment and cause chaos no matter what. And this is truly the struggle of mankind. People were very violent in those days. I remember reading about this Frankish knight. I think it was Tancred or Bohemond. It was one of those two. When the Greeks asked the Franks for help against the Turks in the First Crusade, there was a meeting between the Greeks and the French, and there was this one French knight, I want to say Bohemond or Tancred. But nonetheless, the French had, these big beards, and the Greek style was to be beardless. And the Greeks started making fun of this guy for his big beard. Oh, look at his big beard, it looks like a broom or whatever. And this French knight took his sword out and just started killing these Greeks because they made fun of his beard. Like, that was that. You make fun of my beard, I'm going to kill you. Nowadays, if you ever heard anything like that, people would say, oh, he's crazy, oh, he's sensitive, oh, he's insecure, blah, 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 what's wrong with him? But in those days, that was considered manly behavior. It was a different world in those days. Different world. But anyway, that's enough storytelling for now. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.